Is there a way out? Can I change my brain? Am I just a victim to who I am? I'm your host, Steve Sisler. Stay tuned for another episode of Behavioral Insights.
Episode 37 on the Behavioral Insights podcast. Coming up, the power of regulated thinking. Thanks for joining me. We're going to be talking about compliance and regulated thinking, often what I call static thinking. All right, so what is regulated thinking? Well, before I get into that, I want you to be familiar with this attitude and what it's all about when Edward Spranger first brought it into the public's attention in 1928. So this regulated thinking really comes from a religious context, and he called it a religious attitude. I refer to this current model as compliance, which is another way of expressing a regulated thought pattern. So there's adherence, there's strict adherence in this pattern of thinking. There are walls, there are boundaries, there are lines that cannot be crossed. So that's really what regulated or compliant thinking is all about. According to Spranger, he said that life is an alternating play of experiences whose content depends on these two factors, fate in the broadest sense of the term, and the soul. And so he obviously believed people had souls, and that there were issues of fate. You know, what happens, happens. And so these different experiences, according to Spranger, that people experience, they contain values in varying degrees. So we will value the experience in a varying degree. And he believed that the meaning of each experience sounded a particular value tone in the mind of the experiencing person. And so another way of saying this is, if we have a valuing experience and we believe that this valuing experience in its significance is all about the total meaning of life, then this would be a religious experience. So religious experiences, according to Spranger, are those experiences that we value to the degree that it encompasses total meaning. In other words, seeing the shape of Jesus in the clouds, you see that, you're having a really bad day, you look up and you see that, and in the whole scheme of things, that experience that you have seeing that shape of Jesus in the clouds has a very strong degree of value to where it has total meaning for you. And no matter how subjective this experience, the significance is equal to the total meaning of life or the highest value experience. So the religious value element is therefore defined by the condition, instinctive or rational, in which a single experience is either positively or negatively related to the total value of life. And so some people still currently call this type of valuation a traditional value. And this is why people keep traditions alive, because they have such significance. So a tradition is a belief or a behavior passed down within a group or society with symbolic meaning or special significance with origins in the past. And again, it's related to the total meaning of life. In this context, you got to remember, traditions have life-altering meaning, which is why they've been cherished and passed down through the ages. So in this sense, a tradition is associated with a high-value experience as defined by Edward Spranger. So the concepts of tradition and traditional values are frequently used, obviously, in political and religious discourses in hopes of establishing the legitimacy of a particular set of values and establishing the total meaning of life. So politics and religion, this is why these are such hot buttons. So in the United States, in the 20th and 21st centuries, the concept of tradition has been used to argue for the centrality and legitimacy of conservative religious values. It's for this reason that those who score high on a traditional value index will likely have strong beliefs based upon right and wrong sets of ideas. And so, again, this is, and again, back to Spranger's type thinking, right and wrong, good and bad, yes and no, light and dark, up and down, these very strong contrasting elements that we think of within our minds, we also call this structured thinking. So when there are structures and boundaries in our thinking, you can trace them all the way back to system thinking or systemic thinking, where if I do this, then I suffer the consequences, but if I do that, I reap the benefits. So this goes back to the rewards and punishments thinking that comes out of all religious institutions, all religious frameworks, all religious thinking. All this black and white either or mindset thinking is birthed and grown through religious mindsets throughout the centuries or millennia. And so that's what you need to understand. So because of the either or nature of this mindset, and because its root in its root there are imaginary penalties for violating the boundaries, they tend to leave no wiggle room for themselves or other people when the boundaries are crossed. So the one unfortunate trait associated with regulated thinking is that they hold those outside of the box that's created to the same ironclad rules the people in the box hold themselves to. And this is why people that have very strict mindsets try to, their endeavor in life is to get everybody to think like they think, because they really believe that it's wrong to think like this and it's right to think like that. And this goes for everybody. So that's something very, very powerful. And it's why this element is so powerful. So first of all, I don't want you to associate black and white thinking with borderline personality disorder, because that's associated with a psychological term known as splitting. Traditional thinking has nothing to do with this, so I don't want you to think that. So if you're a high traditional thinker, then you likely think like this: it's tight, but it's right. I often call this the OTP, or the Old Testament parent. These are the people that think in terms of, I brought you into this world, I can take you out, when they're talking to their kids. They believe if it's not broken, why are we trying to fix it? So these are the structures they think in line with. To really place this idea into a workable context, I want you to think of living up to an ideal. So traditional thinkers view the world through a particular lens. They really receive their marching orders from a higher value system. It's so high, it's higher than their own. And therefore, they believe they answer to a higher authority. So this takes us into the traditional concepts that we find in religion. And again, I'm saying this way because this is where the systemic or the regulated, compliant mindset has evolved from, which where it's coming from. And so although traditional religions are basically designed to encourage people through communal activities, tribalism, solidarity, and usually a conversion process that hopefully unites them with the gods and ensures their safe passage into eternal life, its fundamental flaw is really at its root. So religion acts as a seemingly necessary framework for positive self-maintenance, self-esteem, role awareness, self-direction, and really communal benevolence. It's all about keeping a society safe and together and thinking along the same mind. Unfortunately, it creates the very thing it's designed to destroy, which are performance initiatives. Now, I've been saying this for quite a long time, that these types of mindsets cause individuals to perform for the gods in hopes of getting a reward for the performance. Now, granted, many religions support a positive self and generally bring better self-awareness and self-esteem to people. That's really great, and it's awesome that happens. But the process typically begins on a negative, as it must in order to warrant its imposition. So the idea of a negative self, or the I'm bad theory, was likely birthed through the theory of the fall of man within the garden myth that we see in the Genesis narrative in the Torah. So this speaks of the disobedience of all mankind early on in this narrative. And really, this is an astounding Hebrew attempt at understanding what I would consider the duality within all of us through the power of story. So religion really, it provides people a traditional-based framework to live within that allows for creating distinctions between what many see as right and wrong behaviors. So in other words, the role of religion is to create a cosmic standard for mankind to fall short of while ensuring a roadmap for living up to it, along with boundaries upheld by rewards and punishments to guarantee we stay within it to begin with. So at first glance, it appears to be somewhat successful, but my question is, how successful is it really? Now, I've sort of come to a startling realization that most traditionally minded people really are in need of an external reference point in order to make the many distinctions regarding their self-worth and their intrinsic value as it relates to the world. This, I suggest, is a phenomenon. But there's a fundamental difficulty here. People's perceptions differ widely based upon cultural norms, individual knowledge bases, life experiences, upbringing, geographies. In other words, not all people feel the same way, nor do all people have the same mind. Unfortunately, there's a guaranteed singularity that seems to persist among traditional-minded people. It's never enough to simply believe something for oneself and enjoy that belief in private. People have to create in-groups that force everyone else to believe it with them if it's going to have any real meaning or evidential merit. The larger the in-group, the truer the associated beliefs become. So religion appears to do for us what we cannot allow ourselves to do for ourselves. In other words, if God says I'm good, then I'm most definitely good. But if I, in myself, in my own personhood, say I'm good apart from what God might think, there's inevitably another person somewhere in space-time who could announce that I may not be as good as I say I am. Therefore, may influence other people to believe that as well. So if I say I'm good without any God saying so, then those within the traditional system will deny my claim altogether because they have to. I mean, if I can't be good apart from God, you can't be good apart from God. There is no way you can live outside of the restrictions I've placed myself in and, quote, get away with it. So that's why those that have this kind of a regulated thinking set have to disallow those outside of that thinking set to live however they want, because that causes them to have to reflect on, then why in the hell am I doing this? So rather than verify if whether or not these things are even rational, they justify it and then consider us outside, and you need to come in here where it's warm and safe, where I am. I'm doing the smart thing, so you should too, or else I'm stupid and you're smart, so that can't happen. So that's why that happens. It's just how this type of thinking works. This idea of God declaring we are good or not good not only trumps our behaviors in regards to how we think about our behaviors, it ultimately modifies our behaviors. So when the traditional either or attribute is applied to this model, a black and white mindset always tends to accompany it. So ideas become right or wrong and good or bad. Or we say black and white, or black or white. I don't know why I'm vomiting here. Sorry about that. But there's no wiggle room. So our values become more instinctive because they tend to run on autopilot. We don't really consciously think about them. We simply believe them in the unconscious background. So thinking doesn't have to be the enemy of belief. It can also help support or discourage a bad belief. So thinking mustn't always be subject to belief as if the belief has more enormity. Both thinking and believing are done with the same mind. They can't be separated. People's beliefs differ in that people and what they value are fundamentally different, just as our fingerprints are different. Thinking is an essential part of being human. We have the capacity to think for a very good reason. It keeps us safe. So the point I'm trying to make here is when you get into regulated thinking and you're seeing the world through a regulated lens, everybody must think alike on some level. And so the people that have very high regulated attitudes need you to be like them. It's just part of how that thinking works. For example, one male mindset, let's say, might believe it's a good thing to physically and brutally beat a woman into submission, maybe because of some cultural standard or some religious fundamental idea, and accepts within their personal religious frame set this kind of thinking. However, another person might think it's not good to beat people. They might think it's good to support women because they're, quote, a weaker vessel. And this person may believe this because the scripture teaches the woman who was deceived first, and not the man, as the Genesis narrative suggests. This comes from St. Paul. One believes a woman to be completely inferior, while another believes many women to be what the King James Bible calls silly or gullible, as St. Paul believed. So it's these cultures built around regulating mindsets. Judaism, for example, is a shame-based culture with a particular patriarchal frame of mind. Men are in charge and women are cattle in some respect. And you see a lot of this throughout the Middle East, by the way. So a lot of these Abrahamic faiths think this way. But this, again, is traditionally minded thinking based upon the Judeo-Christian perspective. And there are other perspectives, but they're similar in that they're black and white in their thinking. So good is subject to an individual's perception, which can differ enormously between people and is based on one's personal interests, attitudes, worldview, culture, or upbringing. In other words, without an outside influence, and we're, let's say, outside the physical world system or this planet, establishing a standard rule of conduct, people tend towards what appears to be right in their own eyes. So as human beings, we either do what we think is right, or we do what we think we're supposed to do based upon what a higher authority believes is right. So in other words, while one believes it's okay to have a glass of wine, another believes that to be a sin. When I was growing up, it was a sin to drink wine. It was a sin to smoke. And if you smoked and then you were in a car accident and you died, you were going to hell where you're going to smoke some more. And I don't mean a cigarette. And I know a lot of people don't think this today. But when you're raised believing this and thinking this, it messes with your mind. So I can remember listening to conversations between my parents or my mom and my grandfather around the table, where these would be very, very elevated, loud conversations, never a fight, but it sounded like one, but just differing ways of thinking, but all based upon either or, you're right or you're wrong. There's no gray, there's no middle ground. And so I firsthand experienced what it is like to live in a regulated household. And so, unfortunately, many with strict, traditionally minded mindsets really cannot allow other people to participate in whatever they themselves believe to be wrong. That's why when you have high regulated thinkers, if it's wrong for me to do it, it's wrong for you to do it. And the reason being is because the foundational mindset comes from the totality of life thinking we talked about in the very beginning of this talk. And that covers all peoples, all kindreds, all races. And this is why often, maybe only in the Abrahamic faith groups, they're all trying to take over the world and establish their regulated thinking for all human beings to adhere to. So you get real extreme groups, maybe like the Taliban, right? A real extreme group that says, you think like this, you have to do this. Think Sharia law, for example, is much like Old Testament law. So the Hebrews did this, and the Taliban does this. And if you disagree, we'll just basically wipe you off the face of the earth. So we see this in the Old Testament of the Bible. In the first case of, genocide is the taking of Jericho, the city of Jericho, by the Hebrews, and they killed every living thing, men, women, children, babies, animals, wiped it right off the face of the earth. And so to establish a regulated thinking mindset and a structured way of living. Now, the Taliban today, and we're talking about 2019, folks, still doing this. And they believe we're going to make you adhere to this regulated thinking. Um, and if you don't do it, we're just going to kill you. Now, the faith that I came out of, evangelicalism, they believe the exact same thing, but they're just going to let Jesus do it. They're not doing that right now, but they believe it's going to be done, and they want to escape it. So, your Left Behind series of books that are out there sold 60 million copies. We better get right, because if you're left behind, then the Taliban's going to happen. And this is going to be Jesus, his angels, and all the Christians that left in the rapture. They're all going to show up with swords too. And this is the apocalyptic imagery in Pauline eschatology that teaches the same thing all Abrahamic faiths teach, that this is how it needs to be, and if you don't line up, you're in really big trouble. So those are the contexts for regulated thinking sets and really where they originate from and come from. And in these bounded sets of thinking, there are extremes, and then there's also non-extremes. So we can't put everybody in the same basket here. You've got Southern Baptists that think this way, and you've got Pentecostals that think this way. And if you're not baptized that way, that's called Jesus only. If you're not baptized that way, you're going to hell. I have a friend, if he wears long sleeves, and if you wear short sleeves, that's a big bad thing to do. You're in big trouble there. So he would wear long sleeves in a factory in 120 degrees. Simply because scared to death to show his arms. Or you see people wearing things on their head if your hair is not covered, if your body, all these different things. So again, either or, you have to wear it like this or you die. If you don't do that, you're in big trouble. And if you're living within a regulated religious mindset, there's a million different ways of doing that. That's just why Christianity Today, as of 2012, was the last I looked, has 42,000 different denominations, simply because the way they regulate the thinking is different. So just to kind of put this into context, regulated thinking is living up to an established way of thinking that comes from outside of ourselves that we must adhere to, or else. That's the thinking. And you can make that sound better than it does by semantics and all these different other things. But in the end, you're either in or out. And that's how it works. So if it's wrong for me to do it, it's wrong for you to do it as well. This is regulated thinking. This can be harmful to societies, especially if those who are at the top and are administering, authority over the other people in maybe harmful ways through ego-driven behaviors encouraged by usually a poor sense of self and supported through a religious effort. There can be casualties. Otherwise, we just settle for doing what seems right based on worldviews, community norms, education, perhaps natural instincts. So these imposed rules are really a human phenomenon, and they're prevalent in not just a few religious communities. So the Torah, the Quran, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Apocrypha, and other works of standard rules for conduct. They really provide a peripheral scaffold for emotional reliance and stability and behavioral modification. But if these rules are not followed, there must, unfortunately, be introduced into the system a process of rewards and punishments. Why? To ensure its celestial weight and continued enforcement by the people that preside over it. Do this, or else thus becomes the driving force. Now, all religions offer traditional rules of conduct that, if violated, spell dread and punishment in some form for all offenders. Now, Christianity, for example, offers hell for those in rebellion against the guidelines of conduct or to the unbeliever, whom they believe to be living outside the clearly drawn lines. Hell, by definition, is what I call it, the naughty step forever. Hell's believed to be where all violators will reside for all eternity after they transition from this world. So flames of fire, torture, screaming regret, pain are just a few descriptors that are designed to thwart unwanted behaviors and to following, these religious orders set in stone by traditional texts, regulated thinking mindsets from the past. Spranger doesn't go as far as I go with these ideas around the religious value element, but these are the consequences regardless. Now, there's actually a lot of books out there today about people's, quote, experiences in hell. They go to hell and then they come back, and then they tell everybody how terrible it is, so you better do this or you're going to go there too. I know of several people, I've actually heard people in religious meetings in the 80s share their experience in hell. And one person said they saw ministers in hell because they didn't tithe. So when they were in hell on the grand tour, I guess, they saw a lot of ministers down there who thought they were doing everything right, but because they failed to tithe themselves and made everybody tithe to their organization, I don't know. It's absolutely crazy. But I remember hearing that and thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I'm a part of this kind of thinking. That was years ago. But anyway, of course, these are extremes, folks. So what are we talking about? I kind of got off on a little bit of religious tangent there, talking about how human beings think. And so it's just the way it is. So that being said, those perceived to be living outside of any system, really, designed around traditional operating procedures, which is what regulated thinking is all about, can be harmful to the customarily minded community and are typically expelled. In these, it's these distinguishing trademarks, really, within all traditional religious institutions that perpetuate what I call the prison of performance and enable those to follow hard after the correct behaviors that are acceptable to both the community as a whole and the deity who smiles upon them when they properly perform within the valued guidelines. So again, typically for these strong religious forces to work, there has to be a greater entity that's enforcing it from another outside, let's say, we'll call it a realm. So think of the God in outer space looking at the earth and thinking, all right, do I have to come down there? That kind of thinking. This oftentimes can be really masked through the illusion of love and these types of things. And a lot of your mega churches today, you do not hear this kind of talk. Although there are rituals that you have to go through in order to be in that group and be considered, quote, one of them, you don't hear a lot of hell talk these days. That is really falling by the wayside. Now, there are some people still holding on to that, and that's when you get into super overextended regulated thinking types, where this gets really, really strong. But for the most part, people aren't really talking about it a whole lot. I think a lot of people they don't believe it, to be honest with you. But they're too vested at this point to get out, and they love their community, and it's really fun, and blah, blah, blah. They don't want to miss out on the potluck dinner. So I know there's that that's happening because there are some projects out there where they're, basically polling these people in mega churches, anonymously polling them, and they're finding out that a lot of this stuff is not believed, but they really love the community that they've grown up in and that they're a part of and all that. And that's great. I loved it too. It was just very difficult for me because almost all of my closest friends, the relationship was entirely built on regulated thinking. Like if you don't think the same way, like we just can't get along in the end. Like it's really tough to be friends with somebody who's always thinking you're going to die and go to hell. And even though their reasons may be good and their intentions really great, it so gets in the way of the relationship that you can't have one. And that's the power of having strong regulated thinking. Now, I'm opening this whole discussion up with this pendulum in this full-on other direction here. So understand that you can have a regulated mindset and not even be religious. But I'm just showing you where it comes from, where this evolved from, how this is developed. So anyway, people really have to understand this fundamental truth about behavior. Behavior is modified best by what we believe. What we believe to be the best reason for the behavior's correction. So the claim that behavioral modification is the authentic sign that one has found the true faith, or that one has found the one true God, is both irrational and fallacious. For example, obnoxious people will alter their behavior for the simple reason that they're in a library. Workers in work alter their behavior when the boss shows up. And so a suitor maybe will alter his behavior in order to get the girl, and so on. So people that join in groups that have strong regulated thinking sets will be filled with converts who have aligned behaviorally with what is expected by the traditionally set code of conduct that's been handed down in order to ensure membership within the coveted tribe. So behaving well is really necessary for inclusion within any religious system. In other words, how often over the years that I've been alive, especially when I was more involved in the church, did I see people that were, rancorous or mean or really problemsome. And then they get converted, and then within a year, they're talking a whole different language. They're calling everybody brother and sister. Instead of getting together to have some fun, they're calling it fellowship. Like all their terminology changes, all the language changes. What's happening here is this is known as behavioral modification. So human beings modify their behavior in an effort to be accepted within the group that they are part of that has these standards that they're having to live up to of thinking. And so it's really powerful. And so when people claim that, see, look, they've changed, like that's somehow the authentic sign that they've entered the one true faith, well, look at these people that, were like sweethearts and now they're wearing bomb vests, right? So maybe they're serving the one true God, because look at that behavioral modification. So we modify our behavior all the time if we want to be successful in an environment. It's just how it works, folks. And so this is what people do. There's really a difference, and I want to make this clear, between regulated thinking and religious or traditional thinking. But they're so close, you got to be really careful. So I keep saying regulated thinking, but you can tell I'm speaking in religious and traditional contexts here, and I have been since the beginning. So, but the regulated or the systemic thinking processes, remember I said you could be non-religious, an unbeliever, let's say even, and still have regulated thinking traits, right? So regulated thinking is based on the same principle, but it's associated with something else. So there's, number one, the religious or the traditional regulated thinking set. And then there's just this regulated thinking set that's associated with how things, quote, should be. Now, religion is really about how things are. Okay, so this is the difference. Regulated thinking without religious and traditional context is about how things should be. So remember now, religion is how things are. Remember, on earth as it is in heaven, right? In that famous Lord's Prayer, that things should be, need to be on earth as they already are currently in heaven. So what's happening is what's down here must line up with what is up there. And the whole New Testament context of the kingdom of God is establishing how things actually are, but in a parallel realm. So this is where evangelicals come up with, you are already healed, you just have to receive it. You are already wealthy, you just have to believe it. So religion is really establishing on earth what already is in heaven. So that's the context. Non-religious regulated thinking is really about how things should be, but they aren't that yet. So much like the systemic dimension in formal axiology, it's a dimension of formal concepts. And the formal concepts are ideas about how things should be. So this dimension is the one of definitions, ideals, goals, structured thinking, policies, procedures, rules, laws, oughts, and shoulds. All right? It's one of really perfection. So if a person values something or someone systemically, then that person must fulfill the idea perfectly, or what we would call completely. In other words, you either have obeyed the law or you have not obeyed the law. You're either pregnant or you are not pregnant. There's no such thing as sort of pregnant. Okay? So this is about ideas, concepts, beliefs, okay, about how things ought to be. So again, if a person values something or someone systemically, then that person must completely or perfectly fulfill my idea of what they should be. This is an either-or dimension, much like religious and traditional thinking is, but it doesn't have any religious connotations. You cannot be sort of pregnant. You cannot sort of stop at the stop sign. You either stopped or you didn't. A rolling stop will get you a ticket if a policeman sees you doing it. So that is systemic. The valuation is based on total and complete fulfillment of an idea. So there's no middle ground or partial fulfillment in the systemic. There's no gray. Now, you either perfectly fulfill the concept or you don't. So think of a geometric square. If a square is not a square, then it's not a square. All right? Now, that's profound, by the way. If a square is not a square, then it's not a square. What is a square? It's a quadrilateral, which means that it has 4 equal sides and 4 equal angles, 90-degree angles, or 100 gradient angles or right angles. All right. If an object fulfills this exact definition, then it's a geometric square. If it lacks only one tiny element, 1 degree, it is not a geometric square. All right. So every definition is an idea. So to value something in this way is to give it systemic valuation. All right. It's either a total fulfillment or a non-fulfillment of the idea. So this is what systemic valuing dimensions are all about. It's about the world of yes and no, black and white, and shoulds. There are no possible shades or maybe or partiality. The concept is either fulfilled or it isn't. So this is really, really important. When a person pays too much attention to this dimension or overvalues the concept, the resultant behavior is an overemphasis on doing things by the book. There becomes an excessive preoccupation with doing things in certain ways instead of any old way. There's a strong tendency to measure everything and everyone against a preset idea of how they should be, and an inability to be comfortable with changes and surprises that do not reflect that certainty. Okay, you might be working with somebody like this. It's like when you're with someone and you spit your gum out the window and you're driving your car and the person looks at you and like, you just littered. Like, you feel like you're in trouble for spitting out your gum. And then when you say, it's not littering, then they say, well, somebody could step on it and it could stick to their shoe. I'm using this in an example because I had this conversation with somebody. And so they are very regulated in their thinking. So spitting my gum out the car window while driving was a violation and really deserved an emotional ticket. Now, when a person doesn't pay enough attention to this value dimension, the resultant behavior is an unwillingness to submit to the policies and rules imposed from the outside. It's a skepticism. It's a caution about the value of spending time and money planning for the future. It's an uneasiness when systems are in place and running smoothly. You end up overtly or covertly doing things in your own creative way rather than submitting to what you think ought to be based upon, whatever. Okay, so what about real strong regulated impulses? Intensified valuing of regulation. These are the people that wouldn't do whatever for $1 million. They're very strict on themselves. They're very oftentimes traditionally minded, although not necessarily religious. The odds are usually against, them breaking rules, and they tend to be enforcers. Does this mean no rules are ever broken? No, because it does happen, right? We all violate things that we believe or our ideals at times. But how do we respond to that when that happens? So when you're super regulated and this happens, you tend to justify it. The breaking of, let's say, maybe a moral or systemic code. If they break one, they tend to have a reason they believe makes them justified in breaking it. Often, others see those with this kind of consistency as narrow-minded because they believe there's only one way to skin a cat, their way. They'll usually stick with traditional means that they know work or fulfill their own conceptual ideas and reject everything else. And again, this is a black and white thinker. If you fall into this category, you're going to be very hard on yourself and you're going to be equally hard on other people. You will hold other people to your standards. You hold yourself to them, and then you hold everybody to them. You might be the bad cop in your family, depending upon who else is in that family and where they are. You're looking for a cause and a purpose and will want others to have the same purpose you've got. Here's a good example. If it's wrong for me to breastfeed in public, it's wrong for you to breastfeed in public as well. So when I see you breastfeeding in public, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe she's breastfeeding in public. So this style also understands and appreciates authorities and figureheads. And they'll strive to convert others to their own way of thinking. It's very proselytic. And it's very hard to change these people's minds. Taking commands from someone else is like swimming in handcuffs. So they believe that they set the standard or adhere to an exterior standard well, and they want everybody else to do it too. Using somebody else's method for doing something will feel very wrong. They'll believe certain things for a very long time. They don't update their ideas, especially when engaged in politics and religion. The more regulated and systemic thinking you are, the more you will think the same way for the rest of your life. It doesn't update, it doesn't change, and the reason being is because it can't. They want to color within the lines, and they expect everybody to do the same. If it's wrong for me, it's wrong for you. So these styles create a system around their actions when one isn't present. So these are your systematizers. They're the ones that think if I'm making all the copies in this office, then the copy machine should be in my office. And if I won't move it into their office, they'll buy their own. And so that's how they think. Their ideas tend to be reliable, but even when they're not, they won't give up on those ideas anytime soon. They will feel the need to rein other people in, especially if they're parents, their children, or their mate, when they wander outside their particular lines. They like to think for themselves and for everybody else. They'll remind everyone of the rules that they forgot. These styles will likely take things seriously while others are goofing off or believing they should hold themselves to a higher ideal. They rarely give people 3 chances. Some parents, they're like, have you ever seen a parent with a child and the child's doing something wrong and they want the child to stop and they start the countdown? 1, what's a count up? 2, this is how I was raised. My mom would do this. Stephen, get off the couch. And then I wouldn't get off the couch. I'm continuing to bounce on it. And then she'd go, 1. And I knew that by the time she got to 3, that I need to get off the couch. And so I don't ever remember getting to 3. But that's how my mom did it. But the real serious people count to 3 and that's it. The fakers or the posers, they do this: 1, 2, 2.5. So that's the difference. And you can find them, you can see them real quick. They're trying to be that, but they're really not. So once these regulated people decide, they're decided. Anyway, my mom was a real regulated thinker, and I was arguing with her when I was 24 because I disagreed with something she believed. And here's what my mom said to me. She said, "Listen, Stephen, I've forgotten more than you will ever know." Bless her heart, right? I mean, I love my mom, and this is the way she was when she was alive. I suppose that was meant to keep me quiet. So I would hit this invisible wall, and there was no changing my mom's mind at all. Now, as she got older, that began to wane, simply because life experience was teaching her that that was unsustainable. Now, it doesn't do that for everybody. It happened to do that with her, thank goodness. So seeing that these very high regulated people don't cross certain lines, they rarely give other people permission to cross their own lines. So enforcing their ideas on other people, they believe they are always right. If not convinced, their mind will just not likely change. Now, this works well with scared people that have this heightened awareness of errors and mistakes, and you can see what starts to happen. Analysis paralysis starts to kick in, excessive rightness, needing proof for everything, becoming very rigid, unbending, dogmatic. And we can find these people in the military, in law enforcement, clergy. So this is where people with very high regulatory impulse tend to find work. They tend to find work in places where they have to tote or draw the line. Judges, security officers, what do they call that? At the airport people. Oh my God, the worst thing we ever did was give those folks a badge. Never give a badge to a regulated thinker. Oh man. So if you're like one of these people, you may want to expand your horizon a bit. Take a few risks. Calm down. Oh my gosh. So, I could go on and on about this. What about people with high regulated thinking sets with power needs? Oh boy, here we go, right? If you have a high power need and you're highly regulated in your thinking, this gets even crazier. This is a real enforcing agent. They're very difficult to work with and live with. You had a high dominant emotion to this, and it even gets crazier. It enters into what we call a fevered pitch. So imagine strong black and white thinking combined with a need to control your space and everybody who enters your space, control your destiny. And then you need to enforce it with power. Oh my gosh, this is that TV preacher, Rod Parsley. I remember from the 80s. He actually got in big trouble, and it actually made the newspaper. He tried to strangle his painter. Some guy was painting his house, and he tried to strangle him. There's another guy I know. He actually worked a camera. He was a cameraman at a mega church, And this minister was high regulated thinker, high power, and high dominant combination. He was, some of these camera people, they have a headset and a microphone built into that headset, and they're talking with the sound booth and the people doing the audio video in the back. And apparently he was a little bit too loud when the minister was speaking. So he told them to be quiet, that because he was speaking from the pulpit in front of hundreds and hundreds of people in this megachurch. And apparently that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So this guy just took his headset off, set it down on the camera, got down and walked out. The minister chased him down through the main aisle in the sanctuary. When he got to the foyer, he picked him up by his throat and pushed him against the wall and said, "Nobody walks out on me." So again, these are highly extreme examples of what regulated thinkers can look like. And you can have everywhere from that all the way to the other side. So anyway, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm against religion or any of those things. I'm not. I think, for the most part, a lot of these things are harmless and good, except if you're blowing up folks. That's bad. That's a real problem. But if you're, making people, helping make people's lives better, blah, 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 that's all good and well. I love all that. That's great. And I would go to a church like that. No problem. So anyway, the whole point I'm making is regulated thinking is something that happens to people, and we all have it on a scale. It's either super strong or it's not. It's either in play or it's out of play. And of course, when your regulated impulses are extremely low, you are now marching to the beat of your own drum. And nothing is in stone. You will change. Your thinking changes. Your beliefs change as you develop and grow and learn. You come up with inventive ways for getting things done. You can pull a rabbit out of a hat, but you don't know where it came from. You believe there's more than one way to skin a cat. You're super open to all kinds of different options. You're multi-threaded in your approach to solving problems. Nothing has to be by the book. It's just you're more imaginative and things like that. You're more independent than dependent. You want to do things in your own unique way, and that can change. So I don't want to spend as much time on the other side of this as I spent on the plus side, but you get it. So just reverse everything and make it the opposite, and you'll see how these people think. They're very open-minded. They're not narrow-minded. They think to each his own. Now you can get, again, very extreme on that end. And I just heard of a situation where somebody took a child into a bathroom and raped and murdered the child, and their friend stood there and watched and did nothing. And then when questioned, it was like, hey, that's his problem, not mine. That's the other side in an extreme that is really bad. And so now they're trying to figure out how to charge this person because he didn't interfere. And his whole thing was, hey, he can do what he wants. I do what I want. Maybe I wouldn't have done what they did, but that's their prerogative if they want to do it. So again, no laws, right? Just right. And that obviously it's loaded with problems, that kind of thinking. So that's all I'm going to do. I hope this has been good for you or helps you understand regulated thinking and how all that works. Well, till next time, you've been listening to Steve Sisler, and this is the Behavioral Insights Podcast.